What's the creepiest thing that's happened to you that you still think about to this day? Story 1. Maybe around age 14, early 1990s. We were traveling from Texas up to Tacoma, Washington. We were about out of money, almost out of gas, no food, stuck in Chico, California. I sat in the car while Mom took my younger sisters to the restroom at a gas station. I was riddled with anxiety about our situation and looking down. The car door opened and I looked up. A lady that looked like a brown-haired Brady mom sat in the seat and faced me. She said, "It seemed like you are down on your luck. Take this and give it to your mom. Tell her to pay it forward someday to someone who needs it." I looked down into my hand and there was a $100 bill. I looked up and she had disappeared. Nowhere in the parking lot, just vanished. I cried. When Mom came back, I told her what happened, and she cried. We got gas. There was a guy selling oranges on the side of the road, and we bought a bag and went to a local park that had a part of the river with a little spillway dam, and went swimming and ate oranges for a couple of hours before getting back on the road. I never saw the lady again, but she saved us, and we did make it up to Tacoma to start our new life. Thank you, stranger lady with invisible powers. We never forgot your kindness. Story 2. In college, I was roommates with my childhood best friend for about 2 years. We are very trusting with each other. We would go into each other's rooms freely and grab whatever we needed, to borrow clothes, hairbrush, perfume, and similar things. No questions asked, just a knock if we were in the room to let each other know we were going in. Our rooms are across the hall from each other, with the hall facing the kitchen. So from the kitchen, you could see down the hall where our rooms were. At the time, my friend had very long black hair, and she is very fair-skinned. One day, I get home from work, with my headphones in my ear talking to my mom about my day. I go in the kitchen and grab a snack. I see her walk out of her room and go into mine, leave my room and go back into hers. She looked like she just got out of the shower. Her hair was soaking wet and she was wrapped in a white towel. Her long black wet hair is what I distinctly remember. Also, she made no eye contact with me, but I did not think it was weird. I did not say anything to her since borrowing each other's stuff was normal. I am still on the phone with my mom, so I do not think much of it. I grab my snack, hang up with my mom, and go into my room to watch television. I figured she is getting ready to go somewhere, and we will talk later. About an hour passes and I go to the kitchen to clean the plate I ate on. I see her in the kitchen making something to eat and I tell her, "Hey, what did you grab from my room earlier? Did you find what you needed?" She looks at me like I was crazy and says, "What are you talking about?" So I say, "Yeah, earlier when I got home, I saw you go into my room and grab something. Did you get what you needed?" Sorry, I did not say hi. I was on the phone with my mom. She asked me if I am sure I saw her. I said yes, 100%. She tells me to grab my phone and go to her car as soon as possible, that she needs to show me something. I had my phone on me and she grabbed my keys from the kitchen counter along with her purse and she drags me out the front door and into her car. She then tells me she got home maybe 5 minutes before we started talking. She had spent the night at her boyfriend's and had not been home all day. So she has no idea who I saw. I will never forget the look on her face when she told me this. Complete fear and panic. She called the police and they came along with the apartment manager. They checked the whole apartment and found no one. Nothing amiss. And they were in there a while checking every nook and cranny. The manager got maintenance to change our locks and gave us new keys that day. My friend then tells me that for a week she had been hearing noises from her bathroom like bottles moving, and when she went to check, she found nothing. I have no idea who I saw going in and out of our rooms, but it looked exactly like my friend. I do not drink or do drugs, not on medication. This was in 2014, and I still freak out when I think about it. Story 3. Once I was hired to load firewood into my aunt's basement. She lives alone and left the basement door open for me while she went out. I usually swing the interior basement door as wide as I can when I walk in, and the door almost never closes completely. But once I heard it close, and when I was about to grab another load, I saw that the deadbolt was locked. When I walk in, my arms are filled with firewood, so I would not have been able to lock it myself. I looked out the window and checked the garage to see if she had come home, but she was not there. The door itself was enclosed, so there was no wind that could have shut it. I tried various ways of slamming the door so it would lock by itself, but nothing worked. It is an isolated house, so I would have heard someone drive up, and it is highly unlikely someone walked over just to lock the door and leave, especially timing it while I was piling up firewood. And there are wooden steps, so I would have heard someone walking down them. It is the only time I have ever seen a deadbolt lock itself in my life. Story 4. Just a normal Saturday night, I was watching television home alone with my two dogs when I heard a banging sound coming from the basement. It genuinely sounded like somebody was banging something against the appliances we had down there. There is no access into the basement from outside, only through the upstairs rooms that I was in, and I knew nobody could have come in and gotten past me. With that knowledge, I was not as scared as you might think, more curious about what the noise was. One of the two dogs, who is a real meathead and wants to fight everybody, also heard the noise and immediately bolted down into the basement to investigate. I followed and saw that it was my other dog, banging his head into our dryer and chest freezer, which are right next to each other. My meathead dog was just standing there watching, completely confused. I approached my other dog, calmed him down, and we all went back upstairs. This really freaked me out and upset me because it was such a strange behavior for my dog. Fast forward about 30 minutes or so, and the banging starts again. I instantly look over at my dog, but he is lying down, now also aware of the noise downstairs. We run down into the basement, and this time it is the meathead dog banging his head between the appliances. Again, I calm him down, and we all go back upstairs. Nothing has ever happened again since that night, 3 years now, which ruled out things like brain tumors that I read about online as a possible reason dogs bang their heads, especially since it was two dogs on the same night, and it only affected one of them at any given time. 3 years later, and the three of us still never talk about that night. Story 5. I was driving home from work on a long, somewhat dark road. I will admit I was tired and cold and just wanted to get home. The speed limit was 60 miles per hour, and I was driving closer to 70. Suddenly, a girl with long blonde hair, a black coat with brown fur on the hood, and jeans appeared directly in front of my car. I knew there was another car to my left up ahead, but it was black, and all I initially saw was that it was stopped before I saw her. I managed to maneuver around her just in time. I was completely freaked out, so I turned onto a side street and stopped to try to understand what had just happened. Then a tall guy wearing a black coat with short hair got out of the driver's side of the stopped car, grabbed her, dragged her back to the car while she was fighting him, and forced her inside. I immediately called the police and gave them a description of the car and the direction it drove off in. I never heard anything else about it, and I have not stopped thinking about her since. It has been 2 years. Story 6. My girlfriend and I are in a long-distance relationship. We typically take turns traveling between each other's countries, Australia and Canada. About 2 years ago, it was my turn to travel over to Australia to stay with her and her mom. For some background, my girlfriend's room was built as an extension onto their garage, so to get to it, you had to walk through the garage first. About a couple of weeks into my trip, I woke up at around 1 o'clock in the morning, and the room was glowing red. I looked up at the ceiling and saw a black figure crawling through it. It moved in such an unnatural way, almost like it was breaking every bone in its body just to move. I started screaming, which woke my girlfriend up, and she looked up at the ceiling and started screaming too. Instinctively, I grabbed my pillow and threw it at the figure. The next thing I knew, everything went black, and I woke up a few hours later. My girlfriend was fast asleep, so I thought it must have been some strange dream. At that point, I needed to use the bathroom, so I walked through the garage and tried to quietly open the garage door leading into the main house. Previously, her mom had mentioned she was getting annoyed with us staying up late and using that door, since her bedroom was down the hallway and the door would click loudly and wake her. I stood there trying to open it as quietly as possible, but as I turned the handle and the door clicked, her mom suddenly started screaming at the top of her lungs. I thought she was angry about being woken up, so I immediately closed the door and hurried back to my girlfriend's room. I climbed into bed and gently nudged her awake to tell her that her mom was screaming. She got up to check on her mom and try to calm the situation down. About 20 minutes later, my girlfriend came back into the room completely silent. She asked me if I had seen the room glowing red earlier and a figure in the ceiling. I said yes, and she went wide-eyed and said she thought it was just a dream too. She then told me her mom was not screaming at me. Apparently, when I opened the door, it did wake her up. But when she opened her eyes, there was a black figure standing at the foot of her bed, slowly moving toward her. She also blacked out and was later woken up by my girlfriend checking on her. Story 7. I had a schnauzer that could hear a cat stalking across a Persian rug. The slightest noise could wake her from sleep and set off her constant barking. She made a great tent companion on backpacking trips, since bears, raccoons, and skunks would all get a clear warning if they came anywhere near our campsite. One morning we woke up after a completely quiet night in the backcountry of southwestern Colorado, and I noticed that my tent's central guy line was no longer staked down with the aluminum stake I had used. Instead, it was held in place by a piece of aspen branch that had been carved into what looked like a small tiki statue. It was not overly detailed, but it had a snarling face with teeth carved into the bark, and it had clearly been heated in a fire to give it a dark brown color. My dog had not made a sound, and I apparently slept much harder than I realized. I scrambled out of the tent and looked around the small alpine lake, but saw no other campers and no signs that anyone else had been there. I cut my trip short and hurried the 8 miles back to my car. There was not a single other car in the parking lot at the trailhead. Story 8. This is not the scariest thing ever, but when I was 11, my family and I moved to another town because of my dad's job. We were only supposed to stay there for 1 year, and thankfully we were given a house in a closed community of about 20 houses built for Army officials and their families. One day my parents went out and took my baby sister with them. My older sister was at a friend's house, and I was left alone with our dog for about 2 hours. I was playing in my room when I remembered that the black socks for my Monday uniform were drying in the backyard. I went outside with my dog and said out loud that I wished there was something to do, and almost immediately I heard a young voice clearly say that we should play. I turned around and saw my normally hyperactive golden retriever sitting there, calm, like nothing had happened. I panicked and ran upstairs to my parents' bedroom, turned on the television, and hid under the covers until my family got home. They found me sweating, scared, and paranoid, and although they never figured out what happened, they tried to comfort me. What still unsettles me is that every house in that community was surrounded by 3-meter-tall cinder block walls. The area where my socks were was next to a wall separating our house from another one that had no children. The house on the other side was more than 20 meters away behind another wall, and the wall behind our house bordered only a steep hill. There was no one who could have said that, and to this day it still creeps me out whenever I think about it. Story 9. A few years ago, I was at the lowest point in my life. Several people close to me had passed away unexpectedly. I was being bullied every day at my job, and my life felt like it was completely falling apart. I was beyond being depressed. I could not imagine waking up to another day. I had planned to end my life, bought a one-way plane ticket, gathered sleeping pills, and wrote a series of goodbye letters. On the day I was supposed to fly out to carry out my plan, there was a terrible accident on the freeway leading to the airport, and it was shut down in both directions. I pulled into a nearby pub to have a beer and wait out the traffic. The moment I sat on the patio with my drink, a gentleman asked if he could sit with me. I did not care either way, so I said sure. He immediately told me that whatever I was planning to do next was a terrible idea and that I would regret it. I thought he was just some random stranger, but I listened. He said he sensed I was in deep pain, but that I had an incredible life ahead of me, and that this was not how my story was meant to end. I had never met this man before and had not told him anything about what I was planning. He asked me to hand him my keys and my wallet and said he would give them back after I talked, and he listened. I opened up to him completely and told him about my losses, my pain, and why I was heading to the airport on a one-way ticket to a cemetery across the country where my family was buried. He just listened. Then he took out a lighter, asked me for my goodbye letters, and helped me burn them. He told me I mattered, that I was important to the world, and that after I finished my drink, I needed to go home and get some rest. He said I would be okay the next day, and somehow I believed him. He gave me my keys and wallet back. I went home that afternoon, hugged my family, and slept. The next day I started working on myself, finding a therapist and a new job. Years later, I am in a wonderful place in life, so far removed from where I was that day. To this day, no one in my life knows how close I came to ending everything, But that random stranger somehow understood me and saved my life. I never saw him again, and I do not even know his name. It is the most unexplained thing that has ever happened to me, and I think about him every day. So thank you, kind stranger, for saving my life on that random September day on a pub patio. Story 10. When I was in third grade, my family moved to a new town and into a new house. While we renovated it, we lived in a camper in the backyard. The house was very old, and during the renovation, we found all kinds of things inside the walls: old bottles, an old pair of glasses, letters, newspapers, and pictures of children dressed in school clothes. It was a two-story house, and the stairs became a focal point for a lot of unsettling experiences. At the top of the stairs, there was a small landing before it led into two bedrooms. At night, we always left the light on in that landing in case someone needed to use the bathroom. One brother and I shared a room, while the other room belonged to our older brother. I refused to sleep upstairs because the house made me feel so uncomfortable, so I slept downstairs on the couch. One weekend, my sister, who was older than both of my brothers, came to visit and stayed in my oldest brother's bedroom while everyone else was at school and my mom was at work. While she was sitting upstairs watching television, she heard footsteps coming up the stairs and called out, thinking my mom had come home early. There was no response except the footsteps turning around and heading back down the stairs. When she got up to check, no one was home and all the doors were locked. That was not the end of it. Later, my oldest brother stayed home alone for a week while the rest of us went on vacation. Naturally, he had his girlfriend over a few nights so he would not be alone. One night, she got up to use the bathroom around 3 in the morning and later said she heard children whispering downstairs. A couple of nights later, sometime between 3 and 4 in the morning, she woke my brother and told him someone was in the house. They heard footsteps coming up the stairs, and since the landing light was on, they could see a shadow under the door, as if someone was standing there. Then the doorknob began to shake, but luckily it was locked. Both of them panicked, and my brother jumped out of bed. We had one of those decorative samurai-style swords that are not even sharp, and he grabbed it and moved toward the door. They heard footsteps running back down the stairs, and he followed bravely or foolishly, only to find an empty house. All the windows and doors were still closed and locked. He called the police, but nothing ever came of it. Story 11. Around 2008, I lived in an apartment near my college. The building was set far back from the main road in a wooded, hilly area. One night near sundown, I was out running and nearing the end of my route at the bottom of a hill behind my apartment. I looked up toward the top of the hill and noticed 3 guys on bicycles just sitting there. As a 20-year-old woman, my instincts immediately kicked in. I tried to convince myself I was overthinking it and kept running. When I was about halfway up the hill, they were still there, facing my direction. I did not have a phone and had nowhere else to go, so I decided I would run as hard as I could and scream if I had to. Suddenly, I heard something moving beside me. I looked to my right and saw a German Shepherd running alongside me. I had never seen this dog before in my life. I cannot explain it, but I instantly felt like I was going to be okay. I kept running up the hill with this dog beside me, and as we got closer to the men, the dog moved slightly ahead of me and positioned himself directly in front of me instead of at my side. He stopped abruptly in front of them. I ran past without making eye contact. Once I was past them, the dog caught back up and continued running with me until I turned into my apartment's well-lit parking lot. He disappeared into the trees as suddenly as he had appeared. I ran that same route at the same time every day for weeks afterward and drove that road often, hoping to see him again. But I never did. My friends are convinced he was some kind of guardian angel making sure I stayed safe. I am not really a believer, but it remains the creepiest, strangest, and most incredible thing that has ever happened to me. Story 12. A few years ago, I took my dog out for a walk at night. The apartment complex I lived in at the time had enough lighting outside that I was never afraid of going out for a short walk. One night, as I walked down the stairs, I noticed a large brown furry shape underneath them. I knew for a fact there were 3 thin bushes under those stairs, but that night, whatever that thing was, it was positioned between those bushes. I was too afraid to inspect it, so I walked my dog around the neighborhood for about 5 minutes. When I got back, the large brown shape was gone. I stood there for a moment before working up the courage to go back up the stairs, but my dog refused to move. I picked him up and ran upstairs into the safety of my home. A few days later, I was sitting in the living room minding my own business when, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something brown and furry crawl from the ceiling into my room. That same night, I dreamed that I was being attacked by an unknown creature. I hid under my blanket while it scratched and tore at it, shouting hateful words at me. I became angry and lunged at it, punching and scratching at a large brown furry creature. When I woke up, my dog was standing there watching me and whining. I still have no idea what to think about what that was. Story 13. I consider myself very skeptical about ghosts and otherworldly beings, which is why this experience still unsettles me, because it makes no sense and I cannot explain what happened. When I was in middle school, my family went camping in New Mexico at a campsite near a peaceful stream. My parents slept in one tent, while my brother and I shared another. As I was settling in for the night, I was listening to music through my headphones. When I decided to go to sleep, I took them off and started drifting off when I suddenly became very aware of a soft swishing and scratching sound against the side of the tent. At first, I assumed it was just a breeze pushing grass against the fabric, but then it hit me that there was no wind at all. I asked my brother what the noise was, and he asked what I meant. I pointed out the scratching sound, and he reached out and slapped the side of the tent from the inside. Immediately, whatever was outside struck the tent back in response. We both started screaming uncontrollably as my parents rushed over, and the scratching never stopped. My parents insisted it was probably a bug, a loose tent string, or nearby vegetation, and they grabbed a flashlight to inspect the outside of the tent. There was nothing there. They brushed down the exterior, shook the tent, emptied everything out of it, and shook it again, but the sound continued. I was completely shaken, so I went to sleep in my parents' tent while my father stayed behind in the children's tent. Both my brother and father later told me the scratching continued throughout the entire night. Even now, I am still confused and disturbed by that experience. Story 14. Several strange things happened to me and my housemate after we moved into the top apartment of an old building in Europe, right next to a forest that was locally associated with witchcraft. The town even held an annual witches' parade, which the locals treated as harmless tradition. The apartment itself was enormous, with 3 bathrooms, 2 bedrooms, a study, 2 living rooms, a shared living space, a kitchen, and 2 balconies. The larger balcony was upstairs, directly across from a door leading into an attic that stretched across the entire house. The attic was dark and filled with very old belongings, including porcelain items, antique wooden furniture, and a doll neither of us wanted to touch. There were also children's slippers and black and white photographs of a child from a time when carts were still pulled by oxen. Despite how beautiful the place was and how cheap the rent made it even more appealing, both of us felt uneasy at first. We would often hear unexplained noises, like banging, footsteps, or something falling onto the carpets. My housemate would sometimes text me asking if I heard it too, but she eventually stopped and never wanted to talk about it, as if acknowledging it might somehow make things worse. I vividly remember the first time she was away. It was winter, so it was already dark by 4 in the afternoon. I needed to go buy groceries and left all the lights on to feel less nervous. I looked for my earphones to listen to music on the way, but could not find them, so I left without them. When I returned, every single light in the apartment was turned off except the one in my bedroom. And when I went inside, my earphones were lying neatly rolled on top of my bed. Other unsettling things happened while we lived there, like only the corridor light bulbs popping loudly and burning out one by one, my housemate hearing what sounded like a dog scratching at her door and texting me to let her sleep in my room while I was staying at a friend's place, and me hearing a door slamming somewhere in the apartment while I was in the bathroom, only for the noise to stop the moment I flushed, as if whatever caused it did not realize someone was home. The apartment was also strangely cold, but we lived there for a full year without anything truly extreme happening. Story 15. I was training to become a nurse, and in Germany that means you have to rotate through many different places as part of your education. At the time, I was working at a hospice, a place where terminally ill patients can stay until their final days. I was there for 8 weeks and was in my final year of training. During one of my rounds, I was checking on patients, making sure they were comfortable, not in pain, or simply needed someone to talk to. One patient, a woman who had only been there for a few days, suddenly began breathing differently. So I called her husband, who was sitting in a common room nearby. She took her final breaths while her husband held her hand, and it was very peaceful. I knew she had passed. At that exact moment, another patient rang the call phone, which would ring when someone needed a nurse. I excused myself and left the room, took a deep breath, and went to see the patient who had called. I entered his room, smiled, and asked how I could help him. He told me that his guest wanted to know where the exit was. I was confused because he had not had any visitors that day, so I asked who he meant, thinking maybe I had missed someone while I had been with the dying patient. He answered that it was the lady in the room who wanted to know where she could get out. I went completely pale and felt the blood drain from my legs. I was in shock. I stuttered while opening the window and said that the way to the balcony was there, and from right to left down the stairs was the door, and that I would get him some water. I left the room barely able to breathe and leaned against the wall for about 5 minutes. Another nurse saw me and asked if I was all right, so I told her what had just happened. All she did was smile calmly and say that this kind of thing happens a lot there. A few hours later, I asked the man if his guest had found the way out. He said yes, she had, and that she said thank you for everything. I needed days, weeks, and months to process that. I still struggle to believe it, but since then, I am certain that we carry a soul. Other unsettling things also happened to me and my colleagues later while working in intensive care, but this was the one that stayed with me the most. Story 16. A lot of strange things have happened to me in my life, so sometimes I wonder if I am followed by bad luck or if unusual things just tend to happen around me. I have chosen 3 experiences that I absolutely cannot explain, all of which were witnessed by other people. The first happened at a friend's apartment about 15 years ago. We were watching television and talking when the subject somehow turned to ghosts. I told her I believed there were still things in this world we did not understand, but she laughed and said she never believed in that kind of thing and never would. She jokingly shouted for any ghosts in the room to show themselves just to mock me. A few seconds later, we heard what sounded like a heartbeat, a steady rhythmic thumping. We looked around and quickly realized it was coming from my purse, which was lying on the table in front of us and visibly pulsing like a heart. I grabbed it and emptied it completely, but we found nothing inside that could have caused the sound. The second experience happened around the same time at another friend's house. He had often told me he heard footsteps in his living room, but I assumed it was just old pipes or creaky floors since the house was old. One night, however, my sister and I were there, and we heard them too. It sounded exactly like someone wearing heavy boots walking from the kitchen into the living room, stopping directly in front of the couch where we were sitting. The last incident happened when I was living with my father and sister. One evening, my father and I were sitting in the living room watching a movie while my sister was in her room studying. From the couch, you could clearly see the hallway that started at her room, passed the living room, and ended at the office. Both my father and I saw my sister walk past from her room toward the office. A couple of minutes later, we saw her do it again. We looked at each other, confused, and my father commented that it was strange we never saw her walk back. A few minutes later, she walked the same route again. My father called out to her and asked what she was doing, and then she opened her bedroom door and said she had not left her room at all. We have no idea who or what we saw walking that hallway, and my father still considers it the strangest thing he has ever experienced. Story 17. I was around 7 or 8 years old at a housewarming party at my aunt and uncle's new home, a modest mobile home in South Carolina. It was not a big party, just family, some barbecue out back, red cups, and boxes still stacked in the garage because nothing had really been unpacked yet except the furniture. 2 of my cousins were there, along with a friend of one of them, and we were all playing together, pretending to be princesses in a made-up fantasy game. All of the adults were outside, and there were only 4 people inside the house: me, my 2 cousins, and their friend. The house layout was simple, with the kitchen at the front, the living room next, and then a hallway leading to the bathroom and bedrooms. I was sitting on the living room couch, which we had decided was the princess bedroom, while the others were in the kitchen getting snacks. Without any warning or other noise, we all heard a woman's voice let out an ear-piercing, gut-wrenching scream from the bathroom. It was incredibly loud and sudden, and since the living room was right next to the hallway, it made me jump. My cousins and their friend ran in from the kitchen, looked at me, and then we all rushed into the bathroom together. There was no one there and nothing disturbed, which made sense since almost nothing had been unpacked. Moments later, several adults came in through the back door because they had heard the scream too, clearly coming from inside the house. What still bothers me is that if it had been a prank, someone would have had to get into the bathroom without me seeing them from the couch, scream, and then escape without any of the four children noticing, either through the back door or bedroom window. All the windows were locked from the inside, and no one saw anyone leave. My uncle even checked for hidden speakers right away and found nothing. To this day, the adults think one of us screamed and lied, while we kids swear none of us did. Either way, the mood of the party died instantly, and there was no sign of anyone acting proud of a successful prank. It was one of the most chilling sounds I have ever heard. Story 18. During my last year at university, I lived in a 4-bedroom house with a ground floor and then 2 upper floors, each with 2 bedrooms. My friends lived on the first floor, I was on the second floor, and the bedroom next to mine was empty because the guy who rented it was staying with his girlfriend and almost never slept there. Both my bedroom and his had small crawl space cupboards built into the corners. One day I came home from university and found my friends talking about strange noises they had been hearing at night, sounding like footsteps coming from my floor while I was supposedly asleep. I laughed it off because they described the noises as loud, yet I had never heard anything at all. Since I did not believe them, I offered to go upstairs and check the crawl spaces. We went up together. I opened the door to the empty bedroom, and the exact moment I did, the door to the crawl space cupboard in the opposite corner of the room slammed shut on its own. We all panicked because there was no reason for that door to have been open in the first place. We grabbed kitchen knives, locked ourselves in one of my friend's rooms, and waited for another friend to arrive so we could check the cupboards and the attic together. We never discovered what caused those noises, but it was easily the scariest thing that happened the entire year we lived there. Story 19. I do not think I have ever talked about this with anyone because it still hurts to think about it, but I really wanted to share it. This one is a bit long. I had a neighbor who was around 30 years old, and he was an incredibly kind person, almost like the older brother I always wished I had. Let's call him Adam. He was good at everything, obsessed with fitness, talented at singing, playing instruments, dancing, sports, and cooking. Whenever he could, he would take me and my younger brother to the beach. This happened 3 days before my 14th birthday. One morning on my way to school, I suddenly had a vivid image flash in my mind of him getting into an accident and dying. It felt so real that I almost cried, but I told myself it was probably because I had watched a movie the night before, where a character died. I went on with my day, and around 8 in the evening, my parents received a phone call. I could see their expressions change immediately. After the call ended, they told me they had to go somewhere and would be back later. I did not know what was going on, but I had a strong feeling something was wrong. The next morning, I woke up to the worst news of my life. Adam had passed away. He had been in a serious accident the night before and died on the spot. I did not know how to process it, especially because I had felt something was wrong just hours before it happened. For days I could not sleep, and I blamed myself, thinking that maybe I could have warned him and that he might still be alive. It has been almost 7 years since it happened, but every time I think about it, my heart still aches, and I wish he were still here. I still cannot understand why I had that feeling before it happened, and it scares me to this day. Story 20. I went to a boarding school because my father was in the military, and for a few years he was relocated far more often than the usual 3-year cycle. The school was full of kids in similar situations, so it was rougher than most people imagine when they think of boarding school, with a lot of bullying and fighting. Like most kids, we made up stupid ghost stories to scare our dorm mates. One of the most popular stories was about a former student named Peter who supposedly went insane, killed the other kids in his dorm and a teacher, and then ran away. There were woods nearby with several caves, and the story said he lived in one of them and would sneak back into the school to steal food and clothes. There was a challenge to go to the caves near dusk, run into the largest one, and touch a stone outcropping just before the cave split off to the side, and almost nobody had the nerve to do it. One day, some friends and I were messing around near the caves. I had brought a toy to school, a slightly repainted action figure with a different head swapped onto it, because I did not like the original one. A group of kids who used to bully us snuck up, beat us up, and one of them threw my toy into the cave, laughing and saying that Peter would enjoy it. After they left, I tried to go inside to find it, but got scared and gave up, and it bothered me for weeks. Eventually, I decided to get revenge. The bullies often went to the caves after dinner to challenge other kids, so one evening I snuck away early, changed into all black clothes, put on a ski mask, and hid deep inside the cave behind the stone. When one of the bullies finally worked up the courage to enter and touch the stone, I jumped out and screamed. Everyone panicked and ran in all directions, and strangely, my fear of the cave disappeared in that moment. Later, as I was heading back, I reached into my pocket and felt my toy. It completely chilled me. I know it is possible that I found it earlier and subconsciously put it in my pocket while focused on the scare, but I have no memory of doing that, and I was wearing different clothes. Even now, it still gives me the creeps. Story 21. I lived on a 600-acre farm in Arkansas with absolutely no one around for miles and miles. One night I got home late and went out to feed the animals, and I had just finished and was carrying the buckets back to the barn. As I was locking up the feeding barn, our herding dog, a corgi, suddenly went completely wild and started running toward the woods. I immediately went to investigate to make sure the animals would be all right. I had a handheld spotlight and shined it into the woods but saw nothing at first. The dog was still going absolutely crazy, and then I finally saw him running between the trees toward what looked like a black blotch. It was somewhat humanoid in shape, but the strangest part was that it seemed to absorb the light. I have never seen anything like it. The closest comparison I can think of is how opaque stone does not reflect light, but this thing almost nullified it entirely. Suddenly the dog was thrown up over my head, over the electric fence, which was more than 6 feet tall and at least 9 feet back from where the dog had been. I ran as fast as I could back to the house to get the shotgun. When I came back, the dogs were still barking, but whatever that thing was had disappeared. I fired the shotgun to try to scare it away, and it seemed to work, because I never saw it again. The dogs eventually came back to the house, and I fed and watered them and gave them plenty of affection for protecting the animals. The part that made it extremely hard to cope with came the next day. That specific dog who had chased after whatever it was found dead at the edge of the woods, with his neck snapped completely backward. I was in shock and grief and did not fully process it at the time, but to this day I have no idea what that thing was, and thinking about it still makes me feel sick. Story 22. I was around 12 or 13 years old. My family traveled to Vietnam every year, or every other year while I was growing up, and we would usually stay at a relative's house instead of a hotel. My family's very large. This time we were staying at my uncle and aunt's place in District 2. Since I was a kid, I shared a bedroom upstairs with my cousins, aunt and uncle, while my mom, dad, and brother slept in the room next door. One night I randomly woke up in the middle of the night, which almost never happened to me. I usually manage my water intake so I would not wake up needing to use the bathroom. When I woke up, I heard a strange vibrating humming noise outside. At first I thought it was someone coming home late on a motorbike and leaving the engine running, but the sound seemed to be coming from above rather than below. Then I saw a massive flash of light pass across the balcony right outside our bedroom. Everyone else was completely asleep, and my uncle was still snoring loudly. I panicked a little and closed my eyes, trying to fall back asleep, but my heart was pounding with adrenaline. Then I sensed two entities standing next to me on my right side, and the next thing I knew, my body lifted off the bed. I could feel the sheets sliding and hanging off my feet due to gravity. I heard a different humming sound, like I was being scanned, moving up and down my body, similar to a medical imaging machine. There was also a warm light sensation moving over me. I was terrified and wanted to open my eyes, but I was too scared. Then I felt one of them press down on my stomach. The first time it felt like a light push, almost like something weighing about 5 pounds, maybe a finger or a small object. I was completely panicking at that point. The second time, the pressure was much stronger and sharp, like a rigid object being pushed down with force, as if it were trying to pierce me. I tried to scream and open my eyes, but they were locked shut, and my screams came out muffled, like yelling into a pillow that absorbed all sound. I tried again and again to move or make noise, but nothing worked. This lasted for about 15 seconds of intense pain until one of my cousins shifted in their sleep, and I heard the bed creak. Immediately, I was lowered gently back onto the bed, and the pressure on my stomach stopped. As soon as my back touched the mattress, I opened my eyes, but the entities were gone. The last thing I saw was another flash of light disappearing, along with the humming sound fading into the distance. I looked around the room, but my uncle was still snoring, and everyone else was asleep. I was drenched in sweat, my heart still racing, and I stayed awake for the rest of the night. Story 23. For the first year and a half of college, I worked the evening shift, from 3 in the afternoon until 11 at night, at a small town hotel that was run by my best friend's mom. The laundry room was connected to the main office, and since it opened into the middle of the hallway, we often used it as a shortcut when checking on guest rooms. Everyone usually left by 8 in the evening, and the evening shift worked the last few hours completely alone, since the hotel mostly hosted quiet, long-term business guests. On my first day working alone, one of the housekeepers jokingly teased me about a ghost that supposedly haunted the hotel, and I laughed it off. That same night, while I was alone, I took the shortcut through the laundry room, and when I was halfway through, every single washing machine and dryer turned on at the exact same time. I ran out of the room immediately. I never really mentioned it to anyone and told myself it must have been some kind of timer. Nothing else happened until about a year and a half later, on my very last day working there. Earlier that week, I had an unsettling experience with a guest who was embarrassed to borrow a plunger, and later returned it by sneaking through the unsecured laundry room, walking all the way into the back office, and leaving it silently in the middle of the room without announcing himself, which startled me badly. Because of that, I kept the door between the laundry room and the office shut. During my final hour of work, I suddenly heard what sounded like 3 intoxicated men loudly arguing in the laundry room on the other side of the door. I could hear the clinking of bottles, but I could not understand what they were saying. I called my best friend, who worked the night shift and was the manager's son, and he could hear the voices arguing through the phone as well. Even though it felt surreal and like a bad idea, I opened the door to tell them to go back to their rooms. And the moment I did, the voices stopped and the room was completely empty. I brushed it off, but it was strange that both my first and last days working there involved such unsettling experiences. Story 24. This did not happen directly to me, but I was affected by it and got some very bad feelings afterward. My best friend and his mom were moving out of their house, and they were the only ones who had lived there. Before leaving, he took one last selfie in his room. When he showed the picture to his mom, she asked who the person behind him was. Looking closer, he noticed a pale white face, almost like a mask, appearing over his shoulder from the attic hatch above his room. He had always heard noises from the attic but had never seen anything. A few weeks later, we went on a wrestling trip and stayed in a hotel, and he showed the photo to everyone sharing our room. After that, strange things started happening. We began hearing knocks on the hotel room door when no one was there, and we caught brief reflections of a figure in the mirror. Everyone became uneasy and joked that whatever was in the picture had followed us, and my friend became so paranoid that he played Bible verses all night to try to ward off anything negative. He has said that ever since taking that picture, strange things have continued to happen to him. Story 25. About 10 years ago, I was dating my ex, whose parents were extremely strict and deeply religious. The only way we could see each other or have any privacy was for her to sneak out of her window late at night. I usually met her halfway because she was afraid. One night she called me and said she was on her way, which was strange because we had never planned to meet that night. But since it was early in our relationship, I was excited and did not think much of it. The first strange thing that happened was my cat blocking the door, desperately trying to stop me from leaving. I ignored it and went downstairs to put on my shoes, with my cat meowing loudly and following me the entire time. I set my keys on the shoe shelf and put my shoes on, only to realize the keys were gone. I searched everywhere while my cat continued acting frantic. After about 5 minutes, I got another call from my ex saying she had already arrived and was waiting outside, which surprised me because she should not have made it that fast. I told her I could not find my keys and that we could keep talking until I did. She became impatient and started yelling at me to open the door. My cat was still going wild, and in the final moments of the call, her voice sounded different, almost distorted, before she screamed and hung up. I was completely overwhelmed and confused. After the call ended, I turned around and saw my keys sitting exactly where I had left them. I opened the door and went outside, but she was nowhere to be found. I assumed she had gotten angry and left, so I went back inside and called her again. When she answered, I asked where she went and told her I had found the keys. She said she never called me that night and had never left her house. To this day, I have no explanation for what happened, and the memory still deeply unsettles me. Story 26, I moved into a new house in the United Kingdom after a separation, so I was living alone. A few strange things happened there, like knocking on my bedroom door in the middle of the night that would wake me up. Eventually, I moved into the bedroom at the front of the house, and the knocking stopped. That bedroom was at the end of a short corridor, with the light switch for the upstairs lights located just outside my bedroom door. One night I turned off the hallway lights, went into my bedroom, and because I had blackout blinds, it was completely dark. I clearly remember turning off my bedroom light and then using the glow from my phone screen to find my bed because it was pitch black. I got into bed, got comfortable, and lay on my side trying to fall asleep. About 10 minutes later, I heard a loud click coming from right outside my bedroom door. It sounded exactly like the light switch being flipped. I sat up, and light from the hallway was shining through the gap at the bottom of my bedroom door. The fear I felt in that moment was unlike anything I have ever experienced before or since. I knew that could not happen on its own, but I would have heard someone moving around. I searched the entire house, fully aware there was no possible way anyone else was there. I repeated the routine, turning the lights off and going back to bed, thinking that if it happened again, I would leave for good. Thankfully, it did not happen again, but I eventually decided to move out anyway. Even now, I still think about that clicking sound and wonder what was really going on in that house. Story 27. When I was 9 years old, my family went on a trip to China. My parents were always the adventurous type, so instead of just visiting famous landmarks, they hired a driver to take us through rural Sichuan to see yak farms and glaciers. One night, we had to stop in the middle of nowhere, possibly because we ran out of fuel, and ended up in what could barely be called a village. It was basically a long dirt road with one very unsettling hotel and a few corrugated metal buildings. From the outside, the hotel looked unremarkable, but inside the lobby resembled a creepy, almost Victorian-style ballroom. It gave the impression of a luxury hotel at first glance, but on closer inspection, everything was made of plastic or painted cement, like a movie set that was falling apart, as if no one had stayed there in years. At first, our translator told us there were no rooms available, but after explaining our situation, they somehow found one. While we were checking in, I felt a strong sense of unease behind me and turned around. In a shadowy corner of the lobby stood a girl who looked about 12 or 13 years old, staring at me with her mouth hanging open. She was barefoot and dressed in rags. At first, I felt sad for her, thinking she might have worked there and was only a few years older than me. Then she did something that remains the most disturbing thing I have ever seen. Her eyes rolled completely upward and bulged outward far beyond what should be possible. I had once seen a photograph of someone who could do something similar in a record book, but this was a random child in rural China doing it directly at me. By the time I got my parents and older brother to look, she pulled her eyes back in and looked normal again. When we reached our rooms, there was mold on the ceiling and cockroaches everywhere. There was one shared bathroom for the entire floor, down a dark hallway, and the lights did not work. I went to use the bathroom with a flashlight, and when I turned it on, the same girl was sitting motionless in the corner of the bathroom in the dark, her eyes bulging out again. She began making a low, drawn-out sound from her throat that terrified me. I ran back to our room in panic. When my brother later went to check, she was gone, so everyone assumed I was exaggerating. Later, when we went out to eat at one of the small metal shacks down the road, she was waiting for us in the lobby again. This time I immediately made my brother look, and he briefly saw her eyes before she returned them to normal, which confirmed to me that I had not imagined it. She followed us to the restaurant and sat at a table next to ours. By then I was on the verge of a panic attack. Every time I tried to point her out, she would stop doing the eye movement, so my family only ever caught brief glimpses. They admitted there was something strange about her eyes, but did not seem overly concerned. We left early the next morning. I cannot prove any connection, but after that encounter, unsettling things happened during the rest of the trip and afterward. Tea leaves I drank later spelled out the word toxic. My brother became very ill and lost a noticeable amount of weight. I began experiencing deep mood changes and sadness that I had never felt before, and years later I would be diagnosed with severe depression. I do not remember having symptoms like that before the trip. I once shared this story online, and someone commented that it sounded like an encounter with a DOC guy. When I looked it up, the explanation only made the experience feel even more disturbing. Story 28. Not exactly unexplained, but creepy enough that it still affects me to this day. In September of last year, I was asleep in the upstairs bedroom facing the road when I was suddenly jolted awake by the sound of footsteps on gravel. I am very used to hearing foxes or cats on the gravel driveway that leads to our back garden, so at first I was ready to dismiss it and fall back asleep until I realized the footsteps were unmistakably human. I checked my phone and saw it was 3 in the morning. I got up, woke my partner, and we moved into a room facing the back window to see if we could spot a possible intruder. At that point, I was mostly worried about my bicycle being stolen, since it was chained to the outdoor table with a bike lock, but otherwise left in the open. Instead, I saw the dark shape of a person staggering in circles around the central table in our back garden, just walking around and around while muttering and making incoherent sounds. Then the person began slamming their head and hands repeatedly against the back door, making slurred noises I could not understand. The person, a woman, then started throwing herself against our aviary for our parrots and ripped off sections of the mesh netting, trying to get inside. This was behavior I had only ever seen in movies, so watching it happen in real life left me completely stunned. It turned out she was extremely intoxicated. We called the police, who escorted her off our property, and later we learned she lived on the other side of town. We have no idea why she chose our house. It was not unexplained, but it was deeply unsettling, and having something like that happen during the vulnerable hours of early morning really sent my mind into a spiral. Story 29. When I was about 12 years old, I was the last person in the barn late at night, shutting off the lights before heading home. As I was finishing up, I was hit with an overwhelming sense of dread, like someone was creeping up behind me, or something terrible was about to happen. It was the middle of January, freezing cold and windy, and all the horses in their stalls started getting more and more agitated. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind and the fact that horses can be very restless. But after a minute, I could not ignore the feeling anymore and rushed to my horse's stall. I went inside mostly for comfort and warmth before walking home, but he immediately pushed me toward the back of the stall. Normally, that is a very dangerous position to be in, even with a horse you trust, but I had the strongest sense that he was worried about something, and I instinctively let him move me. We stood there in the near darkness for what felt like a long time, my heart pounding, and when I tried to step aside to look out into the barn, he would not let me. He swung his head to block me and gently pressed his shoulder against me so I could not move or see past him. After some time, I honestly do not know how long, the other horses slowly began to calm down, and my horse stepped aside and nudged me the way he did when he wanted affection. I realized he was letting me leave. When I finally left the stall, I was so scared that I sprinted the mile or more home through the dark, slipping and falling on the ice, but forcing myself back up and running as fast as I could in my riding boots. I still do not know what was happening in the barn that night, whether there was a stranger or something else entirely, but I am convinced he was trying to keep me hidden. The memory of the wind, the fear, and the way all the animals reacted still makes my stomach turn, and I hate to think about what might have happened if I had not listened to that feeling and stayed with him. Story 30. My story is not exactly paranormal, But it is burned into my memory and I still cannot explain the overwhelming instinct that took over my body. I was a small 12-year-old girl who did not have many friends, and the few I did have often treated me badly and walked all over me. Even so, I was always desperate to be invited anywhere. One day, a girl I will call Jamie invited me over for a sleepover at her house. I was so excited that I went without hesitation, even though she was one of the worst offenders when it came to treating me poorly. The first part of the day went fine, but later that night we went outside to let her dogs out one last time. One of them, a Chihuahua, ran off into the tall grass and disappeared. Jamie dragged me with her to search for the dog down the neighborhood road while her mother went in the opposite direction. As we walked farther, it became darker and darker until suddenly my skin went cold. Chills ran up my spine, my stomach felt heavy like stone, and my body physically stopped moving. My instincts took over completely and I could not force myself to move. It felt like every part of my mind was screaming at me to get out, louder with every second I stood there. I told Jamie we needed to go back, but she tried to boss me around like usual. Suddenly, I screamed and broke down sobbing as a wave of fear completely overwhelmed me. I caused such a scene that she rushed me back to her house and we went to bed. Later, I found out that a well-known dangerous individual lived in that neighborhood, very close to where we had been walking. I will never forget that raw instinct to flee, and I truly believe that if I had not listened to it, neither of us might have made it home safely that night. Story 31. About 4 years ago, I worked for the conservation department of a nearby town, doing invasive plant removal and trail maintenance. I was often alone in the woods because I knew what to look for and had plenty of experience. I worked from 7 in the morning until 3:30 in the afternoon, Monday through Thursday, so I was never out there at night, and there were usually other people around. One day in late August, I was walking down a trail deep in the woods carrying hedge trimmers, which are fairly solid tools, and since the town was affluent, I was not too worried about being alone. It was near the end of the day, and I was just walking rather than working. I had not seen or heard anyone for quite some time. Ahead of me was a bend in the trail with a large shrub blocking my view of what lay beyond. When I was about 20 feet from it, the hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I broke out in a cold sweat. I trust my instincts because ignoring them once led to a traumatic experience in the past. Without hesitation, I dropped the hedge trimmers and sprinted back toward my truck. The walk should have taken at least 20 minutes, but I made it back in 10. At the beginning, I briefly heard something running behind me, but I did not look back. I drove straight to town hall and then went home without telling anyone. The next day, my boss told me I was no longer allowed to go out on the trails alone. Later that same day, a jogger had discovered 6 mutilated cats on the path just beyond the shrub I had stopped at. Story 32. This did not happen to me directly, but to my son when he was 21 years old, and it is still one of the scariest things I have ever heard. My son was a Marine stationed in the Middle East, and at one point they were doing a training exercise in Jordan with the Jordanian army. They were camping out in the middle of the desert. One night my son was on guard duty with another Marine, and near the end of his shift he was sent back to camp, about a mile away, to wake the next 2 men on duty. While walking back alone, he began seeing dark shapes moving in his peripheral vision, darting back and forth. Then he started hearing loud whispering in a language he did not recognize. In the distance, there was a mountain range in a completely unpopulated area. There were no vehicles anywhere, and the only people nearby were a Bedouin tribe who traveled by camel, not by motor vehicles. That is why it terrified him when he noticed lights moving in the distance. His logical mind tried to tell him they were vehicles, but he knew that could not be true, especially because the lights were moving in ways cars could not, including straight up and straight down. As this was happening, the shadows and whispering became more intense. When he reached camp, he was visibly shaken. The next morning, he asked the other men who had been on duty that night if they had seen or heard anything strange. Every single one of them described the same voices, shadows, and lights. Later, out of fear and confusion, my son made a makeshift spirit board out of cardboard, and they asked it questions. At one point, it told them to leave, so my son went out into the desert and buried it. The following morning, he woke up to find the board placed outside his tent. No one admitted to touching it, and no one could have known where he buried it. Even now, years later, he becomes visibly uncomfortable talking about it. He was never someone who believed in anything paranormal, but after speaking with members of the Jordanian army, he became convinced that they had encountered something known locally as the jinn.